April 1778. The Irish Sea is black under a moonless sky. A single warship creeps toward the English coast, with her lanterns doused and her gun ports closed. No cannon fire yet, no alarm bells, just the creak of rigging and the slow, deliberate approach of a ship that has no business being here. For over 100 years, no enemy force had set foot on English soil. Not since the Dutch burned the fleet at Chatham in 1667 had a foreign power dared to bring war to Britain's own doorstep. The Royal Navy ruled every sea that mattered, and the people of England slept soundly, certain that whatever chaos was unfolding across the Atlantic in their rebellious American colonies, it would stay there. Insurance men in London still quoted the lowest rates in Europe for coastal shipping. Nobody built new forts. Nobody drilled new militias. Why would they need to? They were wrong. And the man about to prove them wrong was a 30-year-old Scotsman with a criminal past, a stolen name, and absolutely nothing left to lose. This is the story of 3 nights in the spring of 1778, a burning harbour, a botched kidnapping, and a point-blank ship duel that turned John Paul Jones from an obscure colonial captain into the most wanted man in Britain. 3 raids, 3 targets, 1 captain who was about to make the entire British coastline feel, for the first time in living memory, like a war zone. By the time the sun rose on April 25th, newspapers from London to Edinburgh would be running the same panicked question. If an American captain could burn a harbour, storm a nobleman's estate, and sink a Royal Navy warship, all within 48 hours and all within sight of the coast, then what exactly was the mighty Royal Navy actually protecting? That question would follow the Admiralty for the rest of the war, and it started with 1 ship, 1 obsessive captain, and 1 piece of unfinished business from his childhood. To understand how a single 18-gun sloop ended up threatening the British Empire on its own coastline, you have to rewind a few months back to a cold harbour in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where the Continental Sloop Ranger was fitted out for a mission that most sane naval officers would have called suicidal. John Paul Jones had spent 2 years fighting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Since his first command aboard the sloop Providence, he had proven, cruise after cruise, that he could outsail and outfight anything the British put in front of him in American waters. But raiding merchant shipping off the American coast was, to Jones, a fundamentally small ambition. He wanted the war fought where it would actually hurt, in Britain's own backyard, in front of the very citizens who assumed the fighting would never touch them. Congress was skeptical. Crossing the Atlantic in winter aboard a single sloop, then operating alone in waters patrolled by the largest navy in the world, was not a plan most committees would approve. But Jones had an advocate in Paris who understood exactly what this kind of mission could accomplish, even if it never won a single major battle. Benjamin Franklin, serving as American ambassador to France, saw in Jones a weapon that worked as much on morale and perception as it did on cannon fire. A single successful raid on British soil would do more to convince France that America was worth backing openly than a dozen quiet victories fought 3,000 miles away. The crossing itself, in November of 1777, was miserable. The Ranger was fast, but not built for comfort. Her crew was unruly and resentful of Jones's demanding discipline, and the North Atlantic in late autumn offered nothing but storms and cold. Jones drove the ship and her crew across anyway, arriving in Nantes and then Brest to link up with Franklin and the network of American agents quietly operating throughout France. What Jones wanted, more than supplies or reinforcements, was permission. Permission to take the fight to England itself. Franklin gave him something close to a blank check, official orders vague enough to let Jones interpret his own mission as aggressively as he liked, while giving both France and America enough deniability if things went badly wrong. Jones spent weeks in French ports gathering intelligence, poring over charts of the Irish Sea and the coastline he had grown up sailing as a boy. He wasn't picking targets at random. He was drawing on a decade and a half of memory, the harbours he had loaded cargo in, the currents he had learned as an apprentice, the exact layout of towns that had never once imagined they would need to defend themselves. When the Ranger finally slipped out of Brest in April of 1778 and turned north into the Irish Sea, Jones was not sailing into unfamiliar waters looking for opportunity.
He was sailing home to settle a kind of score with the empire that had once employed him as a boy. On a stretch of coastline he could have navigated blindfolded. What followed over the next several days would become one of the most audacious single-ship campaigns of the entire Revolutionary War. To understand why Whitehaven mattered, you have to understand what Whitehaven was to John Paul Jones before the war, before the killing in Tobago, before he added Jones to his name and vanished into the American colonies. Whitehaven was where it all began. This unremarkable port town on the Cumbrian coast, tucked into the northwest corner of England, was where a 13-year-old boy named John Paul first walked up a gangplank and signed on as an apprentice seaman. He learned to climb rigging in Whitehaven's harbour. He learned to read the tide tables here. He shipped out on his first Atlantic crossing from this exact stretch of coastline. Whitehaven was not some random target he picked off a map. It was personal. By 1778, Whitehaven had grown into one of the busiest coal shipping ports in Britain, sending fuel down to Ireland and across to the American colonies before the war cut that trade off. On any given night, its harbour might hold 200 merchant vessels crowded together at anchor, protected by a small fort with a battery of cannons that hadn't fired in anger in living memory. Nobody guarded Whitehaven seriously because nobody imagined they needed to. Picture the town for a moment as it actually was that spring. Narrow streets climbing away from the harbour, warehouses stacked with coal and timber, fishing families and merchant crews sleeping soundly through the night with their doors unlocked, in a country that had gone longer without a foreign invasion than almost any other nation in Europe. The fort guarding the harbour mouth was manned by a skeleton garrison, more of a formality than a genuine defence, because the entire concept of an enemy landing party on English soil belonged, as far as anyone in Whitehaven was concerned, to history books about the Spanish Armada, not to the present day. Jones had spent months building the case for exactly this kind of raid. Sitting in Paris with Benjamin Franklin, he had argued that the war needed to feel real to the people of Britain, not just to their government. Burn a few ships in an English harbour, he reasoned, and every coastal town in the country would suddenly demand the Royal Navy protect them too, pulling warships away from the American coast and forcing Britain to fight a war on two fronts at once. It was a psychological weapon disguised as a raiding party.
On the night of April 22nd, 1778, the Ranger dropped anchor a few miles offshore and Jones led two small boats crammed with volunteers toward the sleeping town. He knew this harbour by heart. He knew exactly where the fort's guns sat, exactly how thin the garrison was, exactly which stretch of dock held the most ships packed hull to hull. The plan called for speed and darkness. Spike the fort's cannons first, so no alarm could be raised by cannon fire, then set the merchant fleet ablaze before anyone in the town woke up. It should have taken less than an hour. It did not go that way. The night dragged on longer than Jones expected. Some of his men, given the chance to raid a British town, decided this was a good moment to find the nearest tavern instead of following orders. Precious time bled away while Jones and a handful of loyal officers worked alone to spike the fort's guns, jamming metal files into the touch holes of cannon after cannon so they could never be fired again. By the time they turned their attention to the ships in the harbour, the sky was already beginning to lighten. They had one lantern of burning coals between them, carried ashore in a covered pot to keep it from being seen. It was nowhere near enough to torch 200 ships. Jones made a hard decision. Rather than waste the raid entirely, he concentrated everything on a single large collier ship, the Thompson, packing her hold with tar barrels and setting her alight, gambling that the flames would leap from her rigging to the ships moored close on either side and take the whole harbour with her. For a few minutes, it looked like it might work. Fire climbed the Thompson's masts and lit up the harbour in orange light for the first time in 100 years. An English port was burning because of an act of war on English soil. Then Whitehaven woke up. A local man, wandering home in the early hours, spotted the smoke and started pounding on doors. Church bells began ringing across town. Within minutes, dock workers, fishermen and half-dressed townspeople were pouring toward the harbour with buckets, forming bucket brigades to fight the blaze before it could spread past the one burning ship. The fire that Jones had hoped would consume the entire fleet was contained and extinguished within the hour. Jones and his men were still on the docks when the town came alive around them. What happened next says almost as much about Jones as the raid itself. Rather than immediately retreating, he reportedly stood on the pier, pistol in hand, holding back a crowd of angry townspeople long enough for his own men to reach the boats safely. By the time the last of his raiders pushed off from the dock, the sun was rising and the entire town was awake, furious, and staring out at the ship that had just tried to burn their harbour down. There's an almost cinematic detail buried in several accounts of that morning. As the last boat pulled away from the pier, one of Jones's own men, a former Whitehaven local himself who had joined the crew after being taken prisoner and switching sides, is said to have been the one who raised the alarm that woke the town, sabotaging the very raid he had signed on for. Whether that detail is entirely accurate or grew in the retelling, it captures something true about the whole operation. A raid built on Jones's intimate personal knowledge of the town very nearly got undone by another man's equally personal loyalty to it. Materially, the Whitehaven Raid was close to a failure. One ship burned, the rest of the fleet survived. No British soldiers or sailors were killed. Jones himself would later admit privately that the raid had not gone the way he had planned it. But here is the thing about psychological warfare. It doesn't need to succeed materially to succeed at its actual purpose. Within days, news of the attack on Whitehaven had spread across every newspaper in Britain. Headlines screamed about an American pirate landing armed men on English soil, something that had not happened in living memory. Coastal towns that had never once worried about naval defense suddenly demanded protection. Militia companies were hastily formed up and down the coast. Insurance rates for shipping in the Irish Sea spiked overnight. The Admiralty, which had been comfortably focused on the fighting in America, was forced to divert ships and resources to patrol a coastline it had always assumed was untouchable. John Paul Jones had sailed a single 18-gun sloop into English waters and, in one messy, half-successful night raid, made an entire empire feel afraid in its own back garden. He had proven a point that mattered more than any burned ship ever could. Nowhere in Britain was safe anymore. And he was just getting started, because a few hours after leaving Whitehaven burning behind him, Jones set his sights on a much more personal and far riskier target across the water in Scotland.